Houston, Texas, November 1994. The Bodyguard World Tour had reached its emotional peak, and Whitney Houston was about to deliver what many considered the greatest performance of her career. 45,000 fans packed the Houston Astrodome, the largest indoor crowd Whitney had ever performed for in her hometown. The energy was electric, the anticipation palpable, and everything was perfect, until it wasn't. Whitney was halfway through "I Will Always Love You" when something in the audience caught her eye. A commotion in the third row, center section, an elderly woman collapsing into her seat, security rushing forward. And then, as Whitney continued singing, she saw something that made her voice crack mid-note. The woman was wearing a faded New Hope Baptist Church choir robe, the same church where Whitney had sung as a child. But it wasn't just any choir member. When Whitney's eyes met the woman's face as paramedics lifted her, recognition hit like a physical blow. This was Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, the woman who had given Whitney her first microphone 30 years ago. The woman Whitney had made a promise to, and then forgotten for 3 decades. What happened next shocked 45,000 people and would change Whitney's life forever. Whitney stopped singing completely, threw down her microphone, and ran off stage while the music continued playing. The audience sat in stunned silence, confused and concerned. But what they didn't know was that backstage, Whitney Houston was breaking down in tears, confronting a debt she thought she'd never have to repay and a promise she'd convinced herself didn't matter anymore. If you're ready to witness the moment when fame collided with conscience, when success met shame, and when one of the greatest voices in history proved that some debts can never be forgotten, hit that subscribe button right now. This isn't just another concert story. This is about the teacher who saved Whitney's voice, the promise that haunted her for 30 years, and the moment when everything came full circle in the most heartbreaking way imaginable. The story begins not in 1994, but in 1963 in the poorest neighborhood of Newark, New Jersey. Eleanor Thompson was a 42-year-old elementary school music teacher at Harriet Tubman Elementary, a school so underfunded that musical instruments were considered luxuries the district couldn't afford. Most teachers at Tubman had given up trying to maintain a music program, but Mrs. Thompson refused to let poverty silence her students' voices. She used her own modest salary to buy sheet music, repaired broken instruments with her own hands, and spent weekends organizing small performances in church basements and community centers. Every Friday afternoon, Mrs. Thompson would hold an informal singing circle in her classroom, inviting any student who wanted to participate. Most kids came for the cookies she baked, but a few genuinely loved music. In September 1963, a shy 9-year-old girl named Whitney Houston started attending these sessions. Whitney's mother, Sissy Houston, was already building a reputation as a gospel singer, but the family struggled financially, and Whitney wore the same 3 dresses to school in rotation, darned and redarned until the fabric was more patched than original cloth. Mrs. Thompson noticed something extraordinary about Whitney from the very first session. The child's voice had a quality that transcended training or technique. It was pure emotion made audible, pain and hope wrapped in melody. But what struck Mrs. Thompson most wasn't Whitney's talent. It was her fear. Whitney would sing beautifully during our circles, Mrs. Thompson later wrote in her private journal, discovered after her death. But the moment anyone praised her, she would shrink into herself, as if believing she didn't deserve the attention. I recognized that look. It was a look of a child who'd been told too many times that dreaming was dangerous when you were poor and black in Newark. Over the next 2 years, Mrs. Thompson became more than Whitney's music teacher. She became her advocate, her protector, and the first person outside Whitney's family to believe that this little girl from the projects could actually become something extraordinary. When Whitney's father lost his job in 1965 and the family faced eviction, Mrs. Thompson quietly paid 2 months of their rent, telling Sissy Houston it was a church scholarship that didn't actually exist. When Whitney needed sheet music for a youth choir audition, Mrs. Thompson bought it with money she'd saved for new winter boots, then walked through Newark's frozen streets in shoes with holes in the soles. But the most significant thing Mrs. Thompson gave Whitney wasn't money or music. It was permission to dream. In the spring of 1966, when Whitney was 12 years old and already showing signs of retreating into herself under the weight of poverty and racial tension in Newark, Mrs. Thompson made a decision that would change everything. She had been saving money for 3 years, slowly putting aside $5 or $10 from each paycheck, with a specific purpose in mind. She was going to buy Whitney Houston a microphone. Not just any microphone, A professional-grade Shure SM58, the same model used by recording artists and professional performers. It cost $147, which represented nearly 3 months of Mrs. Thompson's discretionary income. Her husband thought she was crazy. Her fellow teachers called it wasteful, but Mrs. Thompson knew exactly what she was doing. She was giving Whitney something that poverty had convinced the girl she could never have. A symbol that her voice mattered, that her dreams were valid, and that someone believed in her enough to invest in her future. The presentation happened after school on a Friday afternoon in June 1966. Mrs. Thompson had set up a small ceremony in the music room, inviting Whitney's mother and a few other students. When she presented the microphone to 12-year-old Whitney, the girl started crying so hard she couldn't speak. "This is yours, Whitney," Mrs. Thompson said, placing the microphone in the child's trembling hands. "Not borrowed, not shared. Yours, because your voice deserves to be heard." Then Mrs. Thompson made Whitney promise something. "Someday, when you're famous and singing for thousands of people, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember where you came from. And I want you to sing one song just for me. Can you promise me that?" Through tears, 12-year-old Whitney Houston nodded and whispered, "I promise, Mrs. Thompson. When I'm famous, I'll sing for you. I'll never forget." But promises made by children are fragile things, and fame has a way of erasing memory. By 1994, Whitney Houston had become exactly what Mrs. Thompson predicted, one of the most successful recording artists in history. 7 consecutive #1 hits. Over 100 million records sold. Movie stardom in The Bodyguard. She had performed for presidents, royalty, and audiences of millions. The shy little girl from Newark's projects had conquered the world. But somewhere along the way, between the platinum records and the Hollywood premieres, Whitney had forgotten about Mrs. Thompson. It wasn't intentional cruelty or deliberate dismissal. It was the slow erosion of memory that comes with overwhelming success and the constant demands of fame. Whitney's life had become an exhausting cycle of recording, touring, interviews, and appearances. The people from her childhood in Newark became blurry memories, faces without names, moments without context. She remembered her mother's sacrifices, her father's struggles, and the church community that had supported her. But Mrs. Thompson, the teacher who had literally invested her future in Whitney's dream, faded into the background of forgotten kindnesses. Mrs. Thompson, however, never forgot. After Whitney's breakthrough with Saving All My Love for You in 1985, Mrs. Thompson tried to reach out through Whitney's record label. She sent letters explaining who she was and reminding Whitney of the promise made so many years ago. The letters were filtered by assistants, lost in the overwhelming volume of fan mail, or dismissed as another person claiming a connection to the star. Mrs. Thompson tried calling Whitney's management company, but she couldn't get past the receptionists. She even traveled to New York once in 1987, waiting outside a recording studio for hours, but security turned her away before she could reach Whitney. Each failed attempt hurt more than the last, but Mrs. Thompson told herself that Whitney must be too busy, too overwhelmed, too surrounded by people demanding her attention. She made excuses for the girl she'd loved like a daughter, convincing herself that Whitney would remember eventually. But eventually never came. Years passed. Mrs. Thompson retired from teaching in 1988, having spent 42 years helping children find their voices. She moved to Houston to be near her daughter and grandchildren, bringing with her a box of memories that included photographs of young Whitney, the original receipt for the microphone she'd bought in 1966, and copies of every letter she'd sent to Whitney's representatives over the years. In October 1994, Mrs. Thompson was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months at most, probably less. She was 73 years old, and after a lifetime of giving everything to her students, she was going to die with one profound regret: that Whitney Houston had forgotten the promise they'd made to each other in a Newark music classroom 28 years ago. Mrs. Thompson's daughter, Patricia, knew the story intimately. She'd grown up hearing about Whitney, seeing her mother's face light up with pride every time Whitney achieved another milestone. But she'd also watched that pride slowly transform into quiet sadness as the years passed without acknowledgement, without contact, without the song that had been promised. When Patricia learned that Whitney's Bodyguard tour would include a show at the Houston Astrodome in November, she made a decision. She would take her dying mother to that concert, even though they couldn't afford good seats. Even though Mrs. Thompson was so weak she could barely walk. Even though there was no guarantee Whitney would notice them in a crowd of 45,000 people. Patricia spent her entire savings on tickets, $800 for 2 seats in the third row, center section. She borrowed a wheelchair for her mother and, on the morning of the concert, helped Mrs. Thompson into her old New Hope Baptist Church choir robe, the same robe she'd worn when she taught Whitney to sing hymns in her Friday afternoon music circles. "Why are you putting this on me?" Mrs. Thompson asked weakly. Patricia smiled through tears. "Because if Whitney sees you, she needs to remember where she came from." As they prepared to leave for the Astrodome that evening, Mrs. Thompson pulled out a small photograph from her purse. It showed 12-year-old Whitney holding the microphone Mrs. Thompson had given her, both of them smiling at the camera in that Newark music classroom 30 years ago. "Do you think she'll remember me?" Mrs. Thompson whispered. Patricia squeezed her mother's frail hand. "I think once she sees you, she won't be able to forget." What neither of them knew was that they were about to witness not just a concert, but a moment of reckoning that would expose the price of fame and the weight of broken promises. The Houston Astrodome on November 12, 1994, was electric with anticipation. 45,000 fans packed every seat, every aisle, every inch of available space. This was Whitney's homecoming tour stop, her triumphant return to Texas, and the energy in the building felt almost dangerous in its intensity. Signs filled the crowd proclaiming love for Whitney, homemade banners celebrating her achievements, and a collective roar when the lights dimmed was deafening. Mrs. Thompson, seated in her wheelchair in the third row, with Patricia beside her, felt the vibration of that roar in her chest. Despite her pain, despite her weakness, despite knowing she had only weeks left to live, she smiled. She was finally going to hear Whitney sing live. Maybe, just maybe, Whitney would somehow see her, somehow remember. It was a fool's hope, Patricia knew, but it was all her mother had left. The show began with an explosion of light, sound, and spectacle. Whitney emerged in a shimmering gold gown, her voice immediately filling every corner of the massive venue as she launched into "I'm Every Woman." The crowd went wild, singing along to every word, dancing in their seats. Whitney was in peak form, her voice powerful and controlled, her stage presence commanding. She moved through her hits with the confidence of a performer at the absolute height of her powers. From her wheelchair in the third row, Mrs. Thompson watched with tears streaming down her face. "That's my Whitney," she whispered to Patricia. "That's my baby girl." Patricia held her mother's hand, feeling how cold it was despite the warmth of the crowded venue. Mrs. Thompson's breathing was labored. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, but her eyes were locked on Whitney with an intensity that was almost heartbreaking to witness. The concert progressed through hit after hit. "How Will I Know" had the crowd on their feet. "Greatest Love of All" created a moment of reverent silence. Whitney's banter between songs was warm and personal, thanking her Houston fans for their support, talking about her Texas roots. But she never mentioned Newark, never talked about her early days, never acknowledged the people who had believed in her before the world knew her name. As the concert reached its emotional climax, Whitney's crew began setting up for the final number. A single spotlight, a piano. The unmistakable opening notes that signaled "I Will Always Love You" was coming. The entire Astrodome seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, Whitney's signature song, the performance that defined her career. Mrs. Thompson felt something change in her body as those opening notes played. A sudden weakness, a dimming of her vision, a pain in her chest that was different from the constant ache of her cancer. She gripped Patricia's hand. "I need to see her sing this," she whispered urgently. "I need her to see me." Patricia looked at her mother in alarm, recognizing the signs of what might be a heart attack or stroke. "Mom, we need to get you to a hospital." But Mrs. Thompson shook her head fiercely. "After the song. Just let me hear the song." As Whitney began singing, something extraordinary happened. Mrs. Thompson, using strength she didn't know she still possessed, stood up from her wheelchair. The choir robe she was wearing, faded and old, suddenly became visible in the stage lights. And Whitney, in the middle of singing the most important song of her career, looked down into the third row and saw her. Recognition didn't come immediately. At first, Whitney just saw an elderly woman in a choir robe, probably someone from a Houston church who had come see the show. But then something about the woman's face triggered a memory, distant and dusty, but suddenly urgent. Whitney's voice wavered for just a moment, barely noticeable to most of the audience, but she kept singing. She had performed this song thousands of times, could do it on autopilot while her mind raced. The woman was crying, reaching out toward the stage with trembling hands. And then Whitney saw what the woman was holding. A photograph. Even from the stage, even with the distance and the lights, Whitney could see it was a picture of a child holding a microphone. And with a jolt that felt like electricity through her entire body, Whitney Houston remembered everything. The Friday afternoon music circles, the cookies and the hymns, the worn shoes and the quiet sacrifices, the microphone that cost 3 months of savings, and the promise. Oh God, the promise. Whitney stopped singing, just stopped, mid-verse, while the music continued playing and 45,000 people watched in confused silence. She stared down at Mrs. Thompson, and even from a distance, the audience could see Whitney's face transform from professional performer to devastated recognition. Eleanor. Whitney's voice, picked up by her microphone, carried through the stadium. It wasn't the powerful, controlled voice of Whitney Houston, the superstar. It was the voice of a 12-year-old girl who had just remembered a debt she could never repay. Mrs. Thompson nodded, tears streaming down her face, and then her legs gave out. She collapsed back into her wheelchair as Patricia called frantically for help. Medical personnel rushed toward their section. The music stopped. The entire Astrodome fell into complete, shocked silence as 45,000 people tried to understand what was happening. Whitney threw down her microphone and ran. Not toward the wings, not backstage, but off the stage entirely, jumping down into the audience area in her shimmering gown and heels. Security tried to intercept her, but she pushed past them, fighting her way through the crowd toward the third row where Mrs. Thompson sat slumped in her wheelchair, barely conscious. When Whitney reached her, she fell to her knees beside the wheelchair, taking Mrs. Thompson's frail hands in her own. Mrs. Thompson, Whitney sobbed, not caring that her microphone was gone, not caring that millions of dollars of production equipment sat idle on stage, not caring about anything except this moment. Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. The cameras, still rolling for the concert broadcast, captured every moment. The entire world watched as one of the most famous women on the planet broke down completely, crying like a child at the feet of an elderly woman in a faded choir robe. Mrs. Thompson's eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus on Whitney's face. You remembered, she whispered, her voice so weak that Whitney had to lean in close to hear. I thought you'd forgotten me. Whitney's sobs became almost violent, her whole body shaking. I did forget. God forgive me, I forgot. But I remember now, Mrs. Thompson. I remember everything. The microphone, the classroom, the promise I made. Patricia, standing beside her mother's wheelchair, was crying too, as were hundreds of people in the surrounding sections who were close enough to hear the exchange. The Astrodome's video screens, normally showing the performance, were now broadcasting this intimate moment to the entire venue. 45,000 people watched in absolute silence as Whitney Houston confronted 30 years of forgotten gratitude. That microphone changed my life, Whitney said, still on her knees, still holding Mrs. Thompson's hands. It was the first thing I ever owned that told me I mattered, that my voice was worth hearing. You gave me that. You gave me everything. Mrs. Thompson smiled weakly. I just wanted to hear you sing before I die. You're so beautiful, Whitney. You became everything I knew you could be. The word die hit Whitney like a physical blow. What do you mean before you die? Patricia spoke up, her voice breaking. Mom has pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors say she has maybe 2 weeks left. Whitney's face went completely white. 2 weeks. She looked around frantically, as if searching for someone who could fix this, someone who could reverse time, someone who could undo 30 years of neglect and 2 weeks of remaining life. No, that's not enough time. I need more time. I have so much to say, so much to thank you for. Mrs. Thompson touched Whitney's face gently. You don't need to say anything, baby. Just sing for me. You promised you'd sing for me when you were famous. Will you keep that promise now? Whitney nodded, tears making it almost impossible to see. Yes, I'll sing for you. Right now. Anything you want. Mrs. Thompson's smile grew a little stronger. Sing me the song you were just singing. I will always love you. But sing it for me. Not for them. She gestured weakly toward the massive crowd. Just for me. The way you used to sing in my classroom when it was just us. Whitney stood up slowly, her legs shaking, and turned to face the stage she'd abandoned. Her production crew, her band, everyone stood frozen, uncertain what to do. Whitney made a decision in that moment that would become the most talked about moment of her entire career. "I need a microphone," she called out. A stagehand rushed forward with a wireless mic. "And I need everyone to be quiet. Completely quiet." She turned back to Mrs. Thompson. "I'm going to sing this song the way you taught me to sing. No production, no theatrics, no performance. Just my voice and my heart. The way it was in your classroom 30 years ago." Whitney raised the microphone, took a deep breath, and began to sing "I Will Always Love You" a cappella, with no music, no backing track, no elaborate arrangement. Just her voice, raw and vulnerable and completely exposed. But something was different this time. Instead of the powerful, controlled performance the audience had been expecting, Whitney sang it softly, intimately, as if she really were back in that Newark classroom, as if the 45,000 people around her didn't exist. She sang it the way a daughter sings to her mother, the way a student honors her teacher, the way someone says goodbye to a person they love. The acoustics of the Astrodome, designed for amplified sound, weren't built for this kind of intimate performance. But the silence was so complete, so absolute, that every word carried. You could hear Whitney's voice crack with emotion. You could hear her breathing between phrases. You could hear the tears in every note. It was imperfect, messy, and completely heartbreaking. And it was the most beautiful thing anyone in that stadium had ever heard. As Whitney sang, Mrs. Thompson closed her eyes, a peaceful smile on her face. Patricia held her mother's hand, feeling the weak pulse, watching the shallow breathing. The photograph of 12-year-old Whitney and her first microphone lay in Mrs. Thompson's lap, a bridge between past and present, between promise and fulfillment. When Whitney reached the final verse, something remarkable happened throughout the entire Astrodome. 45,000 people began humming along, not singing words, just providing a gentle, reverent harmony that wrapped around Whitney's solo voice like an embrace. They understood, somehow, that this wasn't a concert anymore. This was a sacred moment, a final gift being given from a teacher to her student, from a student to her teacher, and they wanted to be part of it. Whitney held the final note, letting it fade naturally into silence. For a long moment, no one moved. No one applauded. They just sat in the holy quiet of what they'd witnessed. Then Whitney knelt back down beside Mrs. Thompson and whispered, "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Thank you for the microphone. Thank you for teaching me that my voice mattered. I'm so sorry I forgot you. I will never forget you again." Mrs. Thompson opened her eyes one last time. "You were always my greatest success, Whitney. Not because you became famous, because you stayed kind." Those were the last words Mrs. Thompson spoke before she lost consciousness. The paramedics, who had been standing by respectfully during the song, moved in quickly. Within minutes, Mrs. Thompson was being loaded onto a stretcher and rushed out of the Astrodome toward a waiting ambulance. Whitney, still in her concert gown, climbed into the ambulance without hesitation. "I'm going with her," she told her security team. "Cancel the rest of the tour if you have to. I'm not leaving her side." As the ambulance doors closed, Whitney looked back at the stage one last time, at the 45,000 people who had just witnessed her most important performance. Then she turned her attention completely to the dying woman who had changed her life 3 decades ago. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson died 48 hours later in a private room at Houston Methodist Hospital. She never regained consciousness after collapsing at the concert, but she wasn't alone. Whitney Houston sat beside her bed for those entire 48 hours, holding her hand, singing softly, and finally saying all the things she should have said years ago. Patricia Thompson later revealed that Whitney had arranged for the hospital to bring in Mrs. Thompson's favorite flowers, to play recordings of the Friday afternoon music circles from decades ago, and most significantly, to place the original Shure SM58 microphone from 1966 in Mrs. Thompson's hands as she died. Whitney wanted Mom to know that the gift had come full circle, Patricia said, that the voice she'd helped create would never stop singing her praises. The funeral was held at New Hope Baptist Church in Newark, the same church where young Whitney had sung in the choir. Whitney paid for everything: the service, the flowers, the burial plot, and she established the Eleanor Thompson Music Education Fund with an initial donation of $5 million. But money wasn't the real tribute. The real tribute came when Whitney sang at the funeral service, not one of her hits, but an old hymn that Mrs. Thompson had taught her in those Friday afternoon music circles. "His eye is on the sparrow." She sang it a cappella, just as she had at the Astrodome, and when she reached the chorus, something beautiful happened. The entire church, filled with former students of Mrs. Thompson's spanning 5 decades, joined in. Voices young and old, trained and untrained, all came together in harmony. It was exactly what Mrs. Thompson had always dreamed of, her students using their voices not for fame or fortune, but for love. After the funeral, Whitney made a decision that shocked her management team. She announced that she was taking a year off from performing to reconnect with her roots. She returned to Newark, spending time in the neighborhood where she'd grown up, visiting Harriet Tubman Elementary School where Mrs. Thompson had taught, and most importantly, tracking down every letter Mrs. Thompson had sent to her representatives over the years. Reading those letters broke Whitney all over again. Letter after letter, year after year, Mrs. Thompson had written with love and pride, never with accusation or demand. She'd shared updates about her life, asked about Whitney's well-being, and always ended with the same line. "I'm still waiting to hear you sing just for me. I know you haven't forgotten your promise." But Whitney had forgotten, and that knowledge haunted her for the rest of her life. In interviews over the following years, Whitney often talked about Mrs. Thompson, sometimes breaking down as she described the woman who had believed in her first and most deeply. "I got so caught up in being Whitney Houston, the superstar, that I forgot to be Whitney, the person," she said in a 1996 interview. "Mrs. Thompson taught me that my voice was a gift, but I forgot that gifts are meant to be shared with love, not just sold for profit." The experience changed Whitney's relationship with her fame and her music. She began personally responding to letters from teachers who wrote to her. She created programs to provide musical instruments to underfunded schools. She established scholarships for music students from low-income families. And at every concert for the rest of her career, Whitney would dedicate, "I Will Always Love You," to Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, the woman who gave her the gift that changed everything. Patricia Thompson maintained a close relationship with Whitney until Whitney's death in 2012. She kept the photograph of 12-year-old Whitney with her first microphone, and after Whitney died, she had it framed along with the microphone itself, which Whitney had returned to her after her mother's funeral. Today, both items are displayed at the Harriet Tubman Elementary School in Newark, in a music room that was renovated with funds from Whitney's estate and renamed the Eleanor Thompson Music Center. The story of Whitney and Mrs. Thompson became legendary in the music education community, a reminder of the profound impact that teachers can have and the importance of remembering the people who believed in us before the world knew our names. It's taught in education programs as an example of the lasting bonds between teachers and students. It's referenced in discussions about fame and authenticity. It's retold whenever someone needs to remember that success means nothing if we forget the people who made it possible. The bootleg recording of Whitney singing "I Will Always Love You" a cappella at the Houston Astrodome became one of the most sought-after pieces of audio in music history. The official concert footage was never released commercially out of respect for the privacy of that moment, but the audio circulated among Whitney's fans like a sacred text. Music critics called it the greatest vocal performance of Whitney's career, not because of technical perfection, but because of raw emotional honesty. Quincy Jones, who had worked with Whitney on several projects, said it best. That night in Houston, Whitney stopped being a product and became human again. She remembered that before she was a star, she was a little girl who needed someone to believe in her. Mrs. Thompson gave her that belief, and Whitney finally gave her the song she promised. Everything else in Whitney's career was just business. That moment was love. The final chapter of this story is perhaps the most bittersweet. In 2009, 3 years before her death, Whitney returned to Houston Methodist Hospital, the same hospital where Mrs. Thompson had died. She requested to visit the room where she'd spent those final 48 hours with her teacher. The hospital, recognizing the significance, granted her request. Whitney spent an hour alone in that room, and security cameras captured her sitting in the same chair she'd occupied 15 years earlier, singing softly to the empty bed. She sang "His Eye is on the Sparrow," the hymn from the funeral. She sang "Greatest Love of All," which suddenly had new meaning in light of Mrs. Thompson's belief in her. And finally, she sang "I Will Always Love You," not as a performance, not as a recording, but as a prayer, as a promise finally kept, as a debt acknowledged, even if it could never be fully repaid. This story reminds us that fame is temporary, but impact is eternal. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson never became famous. She never made a platinum record or won a Grammy. But she changed the world by believing in one little girl with an extraordinary voice and no reason to believe that voice mattered. She invested her time, her money, and her faith in a child who the world had taught to think small. And that investment transformed not just Whitney Houston's life, but the lives of millions of people who were touched by Whitney's music. But the story also reminds us of the danger of forgetting. Whitney's 30 years of neglect didn't diminish Mrs. Thompson's love, but it robbed both of them of the relationship they could have had. It took a dying woman collapsing at a concert for Whitney to remember the promise she'd made as a child. How many of us have Mrs. Thompsons in our past? People who believed in us, invested in us, helped us become who we are, and we've forgotten to thank them while we still have time. Who is your Mrs. Thompson? Who believed in you before anyone else did? Who invested in your dreams when you had nothing to offer in return? And most importantly, have you kept your promises to them? Share your stories in the comments below. Let's honor the teachers, mentors, and believers who made us who we are today. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to remember the importance of gratitude. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have more powerful stories about the human moments behind the fame, the promises that shaped legendary careers, and the love that transcends success. Until next time, remember that the people who believed in you first deserve to hear you sing just for them. Don't wait 30 years to keep your promises. Keep them today.